or the idea that Jewish people should have a nation in their ancestral homeland, the biblical land of Zion. And at that time, many Jewish people in Europe didn't want to have anything to do with this idea. Initially, the meeting was to be held in Munich, Germany, a much bigger metropolis.
But the Jewish community of Munich refused. They didn't want to have anything to do with those Zionists.
There were all kinds of rabbis who were opposed to Zionism at the time. Either they were Orthodox and they thought that Zionism was a blasphemy and that Jews should not return to Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, before the Messiah comes, or they were Reform rabbis who said, we're not a nation, we're entirely German, we're entirely, French, we're entirely whatever.
Basel had a small Jewish community and a kosher restaurant, which would help observant Orthodox Jews in town for the gathering feel at home. So on the morning of August 29th, after opening remarks, the meeting's organizers stepped up to the podium. A Jewish Austro-Hungarian man named Theodor Herzl.
The room goes crazy. There's 15 minutes of applause. Women faint. Men kiss his hand. It's absolute pandemonium.
After the applause died down, Herzl, wearing formal attire, a suit, top hat, and white gloves, and sporting a thick beard, stood up in front of the few hundred people in the room and gave a speech.
We want to lay the foundation stone for the home that is destined to be a safe haven for the Jewish people.
And then for the next 2.5 days, there's speeches, there's debates, and out of it emerges this organization called the Zionist Organization.
The meeting was called the Zionist Congress. It was the first of its kind.
They come up with a program of what they want, which is a publicly recognized home for the Jews in Palestine.
A homeland for Jewish people in Palestine, a land where hundreds of thousands of Arabs already lived.
Herzl and everybody, I think, who participated in this movement, they regarded it as a liberation movement. It was there to liberate the Jews from the threat of anti-Semitism in Europe. Herzl wrote something quite prophetic in his diary after the first Zionist Congress. He said,
At Basel, I founded the Jewish state. If I said this out loud today, I would be greeted by universal laughter.
everybody were laughing. That was 1897.
In 5 years, perhaps, and certainly in 50 years, everyone will perceive it.
People will take me seriously. So if you think 50 years from 1897 was 1947, the State of Israel was founded in 1948.
Since October 7th, the term Zionism has been everywhere in the news. It's been used to support Israel in what it calls its war against Hamas, a refrain to remind everyone why Israel exists and why it must be protected. Others have used Zionism to describe what they view as Israel's collective punishment of civilians in Gaza, and its appropriation of Palestinian territories, what they often call settler colonialism.
Zionism has been defined and redefined again and again. These definitions are often built on competing historical interpretations. So, unsurprisingly, we received many requests from you, our audience, to explore the origins of Zionism. So, that's exactly what we're going to do.
I'm Run Dr. That.
And I'm Ron T. this episode, Throughline from NPR, we're going to go back to the late 19th century to meet the people who organized the modern Zionist movement.
Hello there. My name is Maud Amelia Chidwell-Wolford. I'm from Columbia, Missouri, and you're listening to Throughline from NPR.
Support for NPR and the following message come from our sponsor, Whole Foods Market. Host the ultimate backyard barbecue with Whole Foods Market. It's the Hot Grill Summer event through July 16th, with sizzling sales on no antibiotics ever boneless beef ribeye steak and beef New York strip steak. Plus, check out sales on sustainable wild-caught Alaska sockeye salmon, organic strawberries, and more. In a hurry? Choose grab-and-go favorites like picnic salads and sushi, plus plenty of cooler-friendly beverages. Make it a hot grill summer at Whole Foods Market.
Support for this podcast and the following message come from Random House Children's Books with The Color of a Lie, a social justice thriller from Kim Johnson about a black teen caught between two worlds when his white passing family moves to a whites-only town in the 1950s, combining historical events with reflections on being black in America to express the experience of being forced to live a life-threatening lie or embrace an equally deadly truth. Available wherever books are sold.
This message comes from Apple Pay. Everyone knows that credit card numbers can be stolen, but you know what's harder to steal? Your face. With Apple Pay, your purchases are authenticated by you, thanks to Face ID, making your smile your signature. Just double-click, smile, and tap. With each tap, your card number and your purchases stay secure. Pay the Apple way with your compatible device anywhere contactless payments accepted. Part 1. You couldn't change your blood.
This is the song Hatikva, or the Hope. It is now the national anthem of Israel. This version is from The Illegals, a film about Holocaust survivors traveling by boat to Palestine after World War II. The lyrics are, as long as the Jewish spirit is yearning deep in the heart, with eyes turned towards the east, looking toward Zion, then our hope, the 2,000-year-old hope, will not be lost, to be a free people in our land, the land of Zion and Jerusalem. As a result, a large number of Jews were displaced and held captive. But then came the Persians, who conquered the land. Cyrus, the Persian king, freed the Jews from bondage. He also helped their effort to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. Then a few hundred years later, the Roman Empire conquered the region and destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. This time, most Jews went into exile in many parts of the Middle East, North Africa, Central Asia, and Europe. A small Jewish population remained. A dream of returning to Israel lived on in the prayers and beliefs of some Jews living in exile. For much of Jewish history, this has remained merely a dream. But
in the 19th century,
the 1800s,
that started to change. There were secular people who later would be called Zionists, who transformed this religious idea into the idea of a secular state.
This is Michael.
I am a professor at American University in Washington, D.C., and at the University of Munich in Germany.
He's also the author of a book called
In Search of Israel, History of an Idea.
Michael says that in Europe in the 1800s, the Jews began coalescing around the idea that there was no reason to wait for a Messiah, that Jews could form their own state in their holy land now by moving backward in large numbers.
Let me distinguish between two major ideas of Zionism. One is a Zionism born out of despair, the reaction, the response to anti-Semitism. And another one is Zionism born out, let's call it enthusiasm, meaning we want to revive Jewish culture, we want to revive the Hebrew language, we want to create something new on the basis, on the foundation of a religious idea, but transform it into a secular idea.
Despair, enthusiasm. These terms can also be used to characterize the contradictory situation for European Jews in the 19th century.
The 1800s are a time when we see the integration of Jews into many European societies. So Jews become citizens of Germany, France, Italy, of other places.
There is a Jewish middle class or an upper middle class like there never had been before. Jews attending university. Jews are increasingly prosperous in business and in the professions. More and more Jews are going into law and medicine, and some of them into academia. It's a time where Jews can live in fancy neighborhoods and they can buy nice houses and send their kids to good schools. There's a lot of Jewish mobility and integration.
This is Derek Insline.
I am a professor of Jewish history at Harvard University.
He's also the director of Harvard Center for Jewish Studies.
And my most recent book, which was published last year, is titled Zionism: An Emotional State.
Derek says that despite the integration of Jews into Western European culture, the 19th century also saw a sharp rise in anti-Semitism.
So you can have a German Jew in their very German home with German furniture, eating German food, going down to eat breakfast and opening up the newspaper, the German newspaper, and reading all about what the anti-Semites have been saying in Parliament about how terrible the Jews are.
Anti-Jewish hatred had long been a feature of Christian Europe. There are complex reasons for this, but one obvious factor was that many Christians believed that Jews were responsible for killing Jesus Christ. This meant that many rulers would scapegoat their Jewish subjects to distract from their own failings. There was a repeating pattern of religious violence against Jews all over Europe. But in the 19th century,
there is the rise of a new anti-Semitism, which is no longer based on religion, but it's based on the idea of race.
The Jews were defined as a different race, and that it does not matter how much they try to assimilate.
This is Anita Shapira,
Retired professor of Jewish history at Tel Aviv University.
She says pseudoscientific theories about race prevalent at the time categorized Jews not just as a religion.
Degrees. Feels like home. oven. Heading to Oxford right now. I gotta fix a tablet. Degrees. Feels a little humid too, but damn. That's crazy. It's like a whole different world out here. It's 76 outside. Like 20 degrees cooler in Oxford. And raining.
but into a completely different race, separate on the genetic level from other Europeans.
And as a result, they cannot become part and admitted as equal by society in which they live.
Until the mid-19th century. If you really wanted to escape anti-Semitism, the usual way out was to convert
to Christianity.
But with this new idea of a race-based anti-Semitism, it didn't matter if Jews converted to Christianity. They would remain Jews. So there was no way out anymore of that kind of anti-Semitism. Because in their ideas, you couldn't change your blood.
And this is the moving force that made Herzl into what he became.
In 1894, a Jewish army captain in France named Alfred Dreyfus was arrested and charged with treason.
It became the trial of the century. He was innocent. He'd been framed.
It was major news all over Europe, and it had a deep personal impact on a seasoned journalist covering the trial for a Viennese newspaper.
And he's witness of the so-called Dreyfus affair.
That journalist was Theodor Herzl.
What Herzl notices in Paris is it's not about the person, Officer Dreyfus. The people go on the street and shout against the Jew Dreyfus, and then they're Jews. And he realizes if even in Paris, in France, the country where the ideas of liberty and fraternity and egalitarianism started, if even there Jews are victims of anti-Semitism, then we'll be safe in no place in the world.
Dreyfus was wrongly convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment at a penal colony. This shocked Herzl.
He kind of went into a tailspin
and started pouring himself into researching and writing to figure out
how do we solve the problem of anti-Semitism, and he comes up with the idea, which is that there has to be a Jewish state.
The Jews have dreamt this kingly dream all through the long nights of their history. Next year in Jerusalem is our old phrase. It is now a question of showing that the dream can be converted into a living reality.
Jews need to have the option to leave wherever they're persecuted into a homeland where they can be free.
No one can deny the gravity of the situation of the Jews. Wherever they live in perceptible numbers, they're more or less persecuted.
So, after months of writing,
in 1896, he publishes a pamphlet called The Jewish State.
Der Judenstaat in German, which means literally the state of the Jews, but usually translated as the Jewish state.
And that's the beginning of the Zionist movement as we know it.
But none of this was inevitable for Theodor Herzl. Up until that point, his life was a prime example of Jewish integration into European society.
Theodor Herzl embodied the Jewish dream, as it were.
Theodor Herzl was born in 1860 in Budapest.
His father had become a prosperous businessman. Herzl had a nice life. He went to university in Vienna. He studied law. He joined a fraternity, middle-class guy in Vienna who partied and he dated.
He had actually a Christmas tree in his home. So he was what we would usually call the typical assimilated Jew.
He finished university. He went to work as a government attorney.
But eventually switched careers and became a journalist, playwright, and author.
His plays were produced in Vienna at the best theaters in the city. He was actually having a pretty good life.
He wanted to be nothing more than a German writer and journalist.
I have to point out the irony here, which is that Herzl really had a veneration for Western European culture. He wanted to be a part of it, but ultimately it's the European culture that kind of turns its back on him and other Jews. There's a sad irony there, isn't there?
Absolutely. He writes at some point in his diary, if I could choose what I'd be, I would love to be a Prussian aristocrat. And of course, as often is the case, people who are rejected as what they think they actually are, they react very sensitively, and he did. He thought, why do people not recognize that I am just an Austrian and I write in German? But he realized it doesn't work. I will always be seen as a Jew, and that's what I would call a Zionism out of despair. He became a Zionist not because he wanted to learn Hebrew and revive Jewish culture and go back to the land of Israel. His Zionism was a Zionism of no other possibility of surviving as a Jew.
Herzl began sending his pamphlet, The Jewish State, to all his friends and colleagues, but the reaction was pretty cold.
Most Jews from his own surrounding in Vienna, and German Jews and French Jews whom he sent it to, they weren't very enthusiastic because they thought anti-Semitism would go away, and he thought, no, it's here to stay.
Coming up, Herzl shakes off the rejection and finds fellow Jews who believe in his vision in a place he'd never been, the Russian Empire.
Hi, this is Melba in Springfield, Georgia, and you are listening to Through Line from NPR.
We just want to take a moment to shout out our Throughline Plus subscribers. Thank you so much for your support. If you don't already know, subscribing to Throughline Plus means you get to listen to our show without any sponsor breaks. And you also get access to special bonus episodes where we take you behind the scenes, introduce you to our amazing producers, and tell you about how we make the show. To get these awesome benefits and support our work here at NPR, head over to plus.npr.org/throughline.
Support for NPR and the following message come from Betterment, the automated investing and savings app. CEO Sarah Levy shares how Betterment's innovation can help Americans save.
The real innovation for Betterment about a decade ago was taking a set of tools that were used by the ultra-wealthy and making them accessible to the average investor. And that includes tax strategies, that includes dollar cost averaging, that includes taking a long-term view and not getting distracted by market volatility. These are all sort of tricks of the trade, and what Betterment did is they basically said, no matter the amount of money you have, it's always good to be invested, it's always good to start early, it's always good to save, and the power of being consistent in your habits is really the path to long-term wealth.
Learn more about automated investing and saving at Betterment.com. Investing involves risk, performance not guaranteed. This message comes from NPR sponsor Visit Fort Myers. There's a My Fort Myers story for everyone. Spend quality time together as you collect colorful seashells from white sand beaches. See smiles light up young faces when they encounter wildlife in parks and preserves. Make treasured family memories throughout their islands, beaches, and neighborhoods. Plan your trip at visitfortmyers.com.
Part 2. Clarion Call. In 1897, Theodor Herzl began sending out invites to the Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland. He sent them everywhere, but at this point, his ideas were still pretty fringe.
Zionism was a minority movement.
This is Derek Penslar. He teaches Jewish history at Harvard.
Most Jews in the world were not Zionists.
Derek says that for many Jews in countries like the United States or England or France, the idea of picking up and moving to the Middle East would have seemed extreme.
We're Americans, we're Germans, we're British. We are not members of a Jewish nationality. We have no desire to go and live in the land of Israel.
But there was a group that was ready to hear the clarion call of Zionism.
So the people who really followed him were mainly East European Jews.
This is Michael Brenner, professor at American University.
The reason is there were a lot of pogroms, sort of anti-Jewish violence, starting in the 1880s in the Russian Empire.
At that time, Russia was ruled over by a Tsar, or emperor, and it had returned to a state of almost medieval feudalism. Life was hard for most people there, and especially for Jews, who faced all manner of discrimination.
That's where most of the Jews in Europe lived, and they were confined legally to a section of western and southern Russia known as the Pale of Settlement,
which led also to a lot of economic problems.
Most of them were desperately poor. They had limited choices of occupations. It was really hard for them to get ahead economically. And then beginning in the 1880s, they began to suffer from overt persecution as well.
In 1881, Russia's Tsar was assassinated by a group of attackers in St. Petersburg. Almost immediately, rumors were spread that the assassinations were planned and carried out by Jewish people.
Jews as a universal solvent. Whatever it is you think is being destroyed in society is the Jews' fault.
Soon after the Tsar's assassination, violent anti-Jewish riots broke out in the Russian Empire.
Stores being ransacked, property destroyed, and then, as things get worse and worse, people getting killed. Rapes, people getting beaten up and murdered.
These violent riots came to be known as pogroms.
These pogroms often happened around Easter because people think about the death of Christ, and then they think about the old religious accusations that Jews are responsible for the death of Jesus.
And they continued for decades to come.
They're quite deadly, and they spread fear among Jews throughout the Russian Empire. And that spawned a massive wave of migration out of the Russian Empire.
It was these disaffected and oppressed Jews from the Russian Empire that made up the core of Theodor Herzl's supporters. More of them attended that first Zionist Congress than from any other country. But this wasn't exactly what Theodor Herzl, a man who viewed himself as a Western European intellectual and elite, wanted.
Herzl kind of jokingly stated that he really wanted to have the wealthy Western European Jews, but they didn't come. He said, I have only an army of beggars behind me from Eastern Europe.
I am in command of only boys, beggars, and prigs. Some of them exploit me, others are already jealous and disloyal.
Truth is, they weren't really beggars. They were middle class, many were lawyers, but they weren't the wealthy Rothschilds and people he would have loved to have in his Congress.
The Rothschilds were a rich Jewish banking family from Germany.
He went to the Rothschilds, he went to the Baron Hirsch. All these people were willing to donate money that they did not believe in the idea of Zionism.
He also seems like he has internalized Western European or European attitudes around race. Even though he may recognize that it's hurting Jews, he did seem to have a kind of, I sense, elitism.
He felt himself very much a Western European person, German civilization, German culture, and there was no doubt some way of looking down, condescending, paternalizing view on East European Jews. And some of the leading East European Zionists took issue with that, and took issue also with his whole view how to transplant what he thought would be the best of Europe and basically build a model society in Palestine. That was his idea.
At the time of the First Zionist Congress, Palestine was controlled by the Ottoman Empire. Muslim Arabs, as well as Christian Arabs, made up around 90% of the population. Jews were an ethnic minority.
Zionists did realize very well that there were people living there. Maybe they thought the country was sparsely populated, but they knew there were people living there.
There's a myth that the Zionists were not aware of the Palestinian Arab population. They were very aware of it. The question is, what do you do with that information? Herzl himself only went to Palestine once for 10 days.
He knew very well there were people living there.
Herzl wrote very little about the Arabs. He wrote some things about, oh, I've seen some neglected houses in Arab fashion. He just kind of dismissed them.
He had a condescending view to Arabs who lived in Palestine.
Herzl wrote in his pamphlet, The Jewish State,
"We should there form a portion of a rampart of Europe against Asia, an outpost of civilization as opposed to barbarism."
in his diary in 1895. This is how Theodor Herzl described his plans for dealing with the indigenous poor people already living in the future Jewish homeland, wherever it would be.
"We must expropriate gently the private property of the state assigned to us. The property owners will come over to our side. Both the process of expropriation and the removal of the poor must be carried out discreetly and circumspectly. Let the owners of the immovable property believe that they are cheating us, selling us things for more than they're worth. But we are not going to sell them anything back."
A year after his visit to Jerusalem, Herzl received a letter from a former mayor of the city, a Palestinian Arab dignitary named Yusuf Zia al-Hadidi,
who wrote to him and said, I really respect how the Jews have suffered and how they are connected to the land of Israel, but you should know that there's an Arab population there, and they're not going to receive your ideas at all favorably.
"Excellency, let me tell you first of all that the feelings of friendship which you expressed for the Jewish people inspire in me the deepest appreciation."
Herzl wrote back and said, don't worry about it.
The Jews have no belligerent power behind them. Neither are they themselves of a warlike nature. Therefore, there's absolutely nothing to fear from their immigration.
No Arab will be dislodged. You will benefit from us. We will bring you our Western technology. You will have happier, better lives.
No one can doubt that the well-being of the entire country would be the happy result.
In his view, out of a European, almost patronizing view, or how could they reject a movement that brings civilization, that brings electricity, that brings new modern forms of agriculture, that will develop this country. So Herzl could not imagine, and did not imagine, that they would be rejected.
After that first Zionist Congress in Basel in 1897, Herzl continued to make Zionism his life's work. He organized more meetings of the Zionist organization, published writings, and went around Europe and the Middle East trying to make connections with world leaders.
Well, according to all accounts, Herzl was a very charismatic person. Even his look, he had this long beard. It looked almost like one of those old depictions of like Assyrian kings. He was a very charismatic speaker, and he was a meticulous organizer. Basically, he organized every single detail of the first Congress and of all the other Congresses he lived to see.
He was always in a train, going somewhere. There's a phrase in Yiddish, he was always tumbling. He was always on the move, on the make, trying to make something work. He was a man of great energy and great vision, and he was willing to essentially stake his life on trying to attain that vision.
The difference between a genius and a madman is very delicate. I am sure that there were Jews that were certain that Herzl was a madman, while there were others that adored him.
By the turn of the 20th century, Herzl had been on the road for years advocating for the creation of a Jewish state. In 1901, he traveled to Constantinople, the city now called Istanbul, the capital of the Ottoman Empire, the ruler of Palestine.
Herzl tried to get the Ottoman Emperor to grant Jews permission to settle in large numbers in Palestine.
Herzl made an attractive offer to the emperor. If you let Jews settle in Palestine, then we will raise money and help you pay off your empire's debts.
The Emperor Abdul Hamid said, no, I'm not going to allow that.
"I cannot sell even a foot of land, for it does not belong to me but to my people. My people have won this empire by fighting for it with their blood and have fertilized it with their blood." We will again cover it with our blood before we allow it to be wrested away from us.
The emperor didn't just decline Herzl's offer. He had implemented a policy to restrict Jewish migration to Palestine because he was wary of welcoming a large religious minority into the empire.
So Herzl got kind of desperate, and he started thinking, where else could we settle, at least in the short term?
He met with leaders of the British Empire and was able to get an offer. Britain would allow Jews to settle in East Africa, one of the territories the empire controlled.
And he pitched this to the Zionist Congress, saying, well, I've got some good news. The British government's offering us land, and no, we won't be in this land forever, and it's not a substitute for Eretz Israel, for the land of Israel. But isn't it great that we've gotten recognized by the British, and Jews can escape persecution, and they can, live here?
But the Zionist Congress hated this idea.
They were betrayed because he was willing to accept a territory other than Palestine.
The land of Israel was a land where there was always a Jewish community, which was always present in the thoughts of Jews, which was always present in their prayers.
So at the end, he raised his hand before the Congress and he swore with the words of the prayer, if I forget this Jerusalem, let my right arm cry out.
All of this took a toll on his health.
He had fainting spells, palpitations, premonitions of doom for a few years, ever since he was about 40.
In 1904, the stress and years on the road caught up to him. That year, Theodor Herzl died suddenly of heart failure.
At the age of 44. He was a very young man.
In the years before he died, Theodor Herzl spent much of his spare time working on a novel. It was called The Old New Land. The story takes place 20 years into Herzl's future, where
the Jews have obtained something. It's not a state. He never talks about borders. It has no army. It's a kind of a community of Jews who live with each other and with the Middle East in peace and harmony. And one of the major characters of the book is a Palestinian